You did not learn language the way other children did. You learned footsteps. You learned the weight of a shoe against the floorboards before the door opened, the speed of a walk down a hallway, the difference between a returning that meant the evening would be quiet and a returning that meant the evening would have to be managed. You read the house before you read books. You read the silence between two adults the way other children read picture pages. And by the time anyone spoke a word to you, you had already decided what kind of word it would be safe to give back. You did not become observant because you were gifted. You became observant because your nervous system understood, long before your mind could name it, that the sound coming down the corridor carried the temperature of the next several hours, and that those hours would be survivable only if you had read them correctly. The breakfast table is where the memory lives now, even if you no longer sit at one like the one you grew up around. You can be a grown person, 50 years old, sitting alone with a cup of coffee in a kitchen that belongs only to you, and still your shoulders will lift a quarter of an inch when you hear a footstep in the hallway outside, even when you know it is only a neighbor. Even when you know you are safe, the body does not consult the calendar. The body lives in the house it learned in. It learned that the moment between hearing the step and seeing the face was the moment that mattered, and it has never stopped giving that moment its full attention. You called this sensitivity. Eventually, you called it intuition. You called it being good with people. You called it understanding others before they understood themselves. None of those names were wrong. Exactly. They were just the polite versions of something older. The accurate name is that you were trained. In a house where no one used the word training, to track another person's interior before they entered the room. You did not choose this. There is no child who sits down and decides to become this kind of listener. It happened the way water finds the shape of the container. There was a parent, or a sibling, or a whole household, whose mood was the weather, and weather is not optional. You learned to look up at the sky before you stepped outside. You learned to read the small signs, the breath held in a certain way, the way a cup was set down, the half-second pause before a question, the slight change in a footfall when something was already wrong before anyone had said it was wrong. Other children were learning to count, to spell, to ride a bicycle. You were learning a private grammar of approach. By the time you were 7, you could conjugate a sigh. By the time you were 12, you could translate a silence into a forecast for the entire weekend. By the time you were grown, the skill had become so deep, so automatic, that you did not even know it was a skill. You thought it was simply who you were. And this is where the mislabeling began. You called it caring. You called it being a good daughter, a good son, a good partner, a good friend, the one who notices, the one who remembers, the one who can tell when something is off before anyone else can. People praised you for it. They told you that you were perceptive, that you were kind, that you had a gift for understanding what others did not say. You took the praise and you held it because it was the only currency in which you had ever been paid for that work. But the part no one told you, and the part you have been quietly carrying for decades now, is that none of it was love in the way love is supposed to be. It was vigilance dressed up as warmth, It was a survival skill that had become so socially useful that no one, including you, ever questioned its origin. You did not develop this attentiveness because you adored people. You developed it because adoration, in the house you came from, would not have kept you safe. Reading would, through a Jungian lens. This is the place where the persona begins its long career. The persona, in his understanding, was the face the psyche learned to show the world so that the world would let it remain. Yours became the face that knew before knowing was offered. The mask was not made of false sweetness, it was made of accuracy. It was the mask of the one who could tell, the one who could intuit, the one whose attentiveness made other people feel seen, which made you, in turn, feel necessary, and necessity, when you have grown up inside a house where love was rationed, can feel almost identical to love. Almost, there is a difference, and your body has known the difference all along. But your mind has spent 30 or 40 or 50 years explaining the difference away. Jung understood that what the persona protects, it also imprisons. The mask kept you alive in a household that could not meet you as a child. The same mask, decades later, is what stands between you and being met now. Because the person behind the mask was never allowed to step forward and say what she actually wanted, what he actually felt, what the small one inside still grieves. The door is closed. It has always been closed, not the literal door of any house you have lived in, but the inner door behind which the first listener stands, the small one who learned the footsteps before she learned the words. You have walked past that door 1,000 times. You have set down cups of tea outside it. You have promised yourself, in tired moments, that one day you would open it and ask the child what she had been listening for all those years. But the day kept not arriving, because the adult life you built was built on the assumption that the door must stay closed for the rest of it to keep working. The marriage worked because the door was closed. The job worked because the door was closed. The friendships worked because the door was closed. To open it would have meant rearranging an entire life around a sentence you were never given permission to say. So the door stayed closed, and you became, instead, the most exquisite reader of every other door in every other house, and people loved you for it. And you accepted that love because it was the closest thing you had ever been offered to the love you actually needed. Not maturity, but resignation, not intuition, but inheritance, not sensitivity, but the long echo of a childhood spent listening for the next thing that would happen to you. The pattern is so old that you have stopped seeing it as a pattern. You see it as personality. You see it as temperament. You see it as the reason you are good at your work, good with your friends' children, good with the difficult relatives at the holiday, good with the people no one else can read. And you are good. The skill is real. The cost of acquiring it is what no one ever asks about. The cost was that the listener was never listened to. The one who heard everything was the one whose own footsteps no one in the house ever bothered to learn. You grew up in a house full of weather, and you became a meteorologist, and no one ever thought to ask whether the meteorologist had her own sky, her own storms, her own quiet sunlit mornings that no one had ever entered to share. They assumed the weather was the room, They never thought the reader had an interior of her own. And this is where the pattern becomes more than a memory. This is where you begin to suspect, in the long pause of a Tuesday evening, alone, with the lamp on and a book unread on your lap, that the life you have been calling yours was actually a long act of reading other people's footsteps, and that somewhere in the reading you misplaced the sound of your own. The reading became the architecture. What began as a child's ear pressed to a hallway grew, year by year, into the entire floor plan of an adult life. You did not notice the building going up around you, because you were too busy listening at every door inside it. The marriage was built that way. The work was built that way. The friendships were built that way. Each room was arranged according to a principle, so old you had stopped calling it a principle. You called it being thoughtful. You called it being considerate. You called it knowing what people needed. But underneath every gesture was the same small ear, still pressed against the same hallway, still translating the weight of approach into a forecast for the next several hours. The house had changed. The listening had not. Look at how you chose the people you chose. Not the surface story, the one you tell at dinner when someone asks how you met, but the underneath, the part you do not say out loud. You chose the ones whose moods you could read before they entered the room. You chose the ones who needed a particular kind of attentiveness, the kind you had been trained in since before you could read. You did not choose them because they were unkind. Most of them were not unkind. You chose them because the rhythm of their interior had a familiar weather to it, and your body, the same body that had once stood very still in a hallway listening for the meaning of a footstep, recognized that weather as home. The nervous system does not distinguish between home and harm when the two have lived in the same house. It only knows the pattern, and it reaches for the pattern, and it calls the reaching love. Jung understood that the unconscious does not disappear. It returns as pattern. What you did not get to grieve as a child, you arrange to meet again as an adult, in a different costume, in a different decade, in a person whose face you have never seen before, but whose interior weather you recognized the moment they walked into the room. The work became its own version of the same house. You found, somehow, without ever planning it, the rooms in which your attentiveness would be needed, the colleague who needed translating, the boss whose moods set the temperature for the whole team, the client whose unspoken expectations you somehow understood before they had been spoken. You became indispensable in ways that no one quite named, because the work you actually did, the underneath work, the listening work, was invisible. People praised your visible work, your output, your competence, your reliability. They never praised the listening, because the listening was the air they breathed without noticing they were breathing it. You knew, you felt the weight of the listening at the end of every day, in the particular tiredness that no weekend could touch. The tiredness of having spent 8 hours reading interiors that did not belong to you. You came home and you had nothing left for your own interior, because your own interior was the room you had not entered in so long that you no longer remembered what it contained. And this is where the architecture becomes a cage you did not know was a cage, because cages built from your own intelligence do not look like cages from the inside. They look like a life, they look like a personality. They look like the natural shape of who you are. The mask of the perceptive one had become so well fitted that you could no longer feel where the mask ended and the face beneath it began. You would catch yourself, occasionally, in the middle of a conversation, performing an understanding you did not actually feel because the performance had become so automatic that even your own boredom could not interrupt it. You would smile at the right moment. You would ask the right follow-up question. You would lean forward at the right beat, and somewhere inside, very far underneath, a small voice would observe the performance and say nothing, because the small voice had learned, long ago, that observation was its only safe form of speech. What Jung called the shadow is not the dark cruelty you imagine. It is the material you had to disown to remain acceptable inside the room you grew up in. For the listener, the shadow is the one who did not want to listen, the one who wanted, just once, to walk into a house and have the house listen to her, the one who was tired of forecasting other people's weather, the one who had her own storm, her own grief, her own appetite, her own refusal, her own anger at having been turned, at 4 years old, into the family's emotional barometer. That one was buried so deep that even now, even reading this, your first impulse is to defend the household, to say that it was not so bad, that you were loved in the ways they could love, that other people had it worse. The defense is the door, the defense is the architecture, the defense is the part of you that still believes the house will collapse if the listener admits she also wanted to be heard. The arrangement asked for your absence and rewarded you for it. That is the sentence the shadow has been waiting for you to be able to read. The house you grew up in needed someone to track the weather, and you accepted the position before you understood that there was a position to accept, and the household, in return, gave you a small wage of belonging. You were the one who knew. You were the one who could be trusted not to make things worse. You were the one who could be relied on to read the room and adjust. The wage felt like love, because at 4 years old, you could not distinguish between being loved and being useful, and by the time you were old enough to distinguish, the arrangement was so embedded in your nervous system that questioning it would have felt like questioning gravity. So you did not question it. You took the wage, and you went on listening, and the listening became a profession, and the profession became a life, and the life became a long, quiet absence of yourself from the rooms you appeared to be living in. The body knew before the mind admitted it. That is the other sentence. The body has been keeping a separate set of books for a very long time, a quiet ledger of every conversation in which the listener was paid in attention. She could not actually use. Every dinner in which she swallowed the sentence she actually wanted to say. Every relationship in which her interior was the foundation everyone else stood on but no one ever asked to see. The body wrote it all down. The body did not forget. The body has been sending you small dispatches for years now, in the form of a tightness in the chest, a fatigue that sleep does not touch, a strange irritation that arrives at the breakfast table for no reason, a heaviness in the shoulders when a certain name appears on your phone. You call these things stress. You called them aging. You called them the cost of a demanding life. They are not. They are the ledger. They are the long, patient bookkeeping of a body that has been waiting, for 40 or 50 years, for the mind to finally sit down with it and read the entries. The door is not only closed, the door has been closed for so long that the hinges have rusted into the frame, and the small listener behind it has grown old waiting. She is not a child anymore. Even though you think of her as one, she has aged inside that room at the same rate you have aged outside it. She has her own grief now, accumulated over the decades in which no one came to ask her what she was hearing. The cost of the architecture is not only what it took from the child, it is what it has continued to take from the adult who never went back for her. Every year you continue to be the one who reads, the one who knows, the one who manages, the one who is good with the difficult ones. The listener behind the door grew a little quieter, a little more resigned, a little more certain that no one was coming. The unconscious does not disappear. It waits. It waits in the body. It waits in the chest. It waits in the small tightness that arrives when a certain footstep, even now, comes down a hallway that no longer exists. And this is the moment the old self begins to lose its authority, not because you have decided anything yet, not because you are ready, but because the architecture has begun to ask a question it never asked before. And the question is whether the listener will keep paying the wage of her own absence for the rest of her life. The question, once it has been asked inside you, does not leave. You can go back to the meetings, you can go back to the dinners, you can go back to the phone calls in which your attentiveness is the reason the conversation works. But the question now sits inside every room you enter, the way a small stone sits inside a shoe, not loud enough to stop you, not quiet enough to be ignored. And somewhere between the third and the fourth conversation in which you perform an understanding, you no longer feel. Something inside the performance begins to fail, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else can see. Just a small refusal in the chest, a hesitation, half a beat, too long before the follow-up question, a moment in which the listening simply does not arrive when you call for it, and you are left, briefly, sitting across from another person with no translation available, only your own tired face, only the sound of your own breath. The exhaustion that arrives now is not the exhaustion you knew before. The exhaustion you knew before could be managed. A weekend, a walk, a long bath, a quiet morning, and the listener would return to her post, ready to read the next room. This new exhaustion does not respond to any of that. You sleep, and you wake tired. You rest, and you do not feel rested. You take the holiday you have been promising yourself for 2 years, and somewhere on the third day, alone in a hotel room or beside an unfamiliar window, you understand that what you are tired from is not the work, not the people, not the schedule. What you are tired from is 50 years of standing in a hallway listening for a footstep that no longer matters. And the body has decided, without consulting you, that it will not stand there much longer. The mind makes excuses. The mind says you only need a better routine. The mind says you only need to learn to delegate. The mind has many suggestions, and the body listens to none of them, because the body has read the ledger and the ledger has closed. The breakfast table is where it happens. Often, not because breakfast is dramatic, but because the breakfast table is where the role used to start its day. The listener used to sit down with her cup and her quiet attentiveness and prepare before anyone else was awake, to be available to whatever weather the day would bring. Now you sit at the table, and the preparation does not begin. The cup is in your hand, the light is in the window, the hallway is empty, and the listener, the one who used to lean forward at the smallest sound, does not lean forward. She sits back. She does not even decide to sit back. She simply does not stand up to listen. And you notice the not standing, the way you would notice a familiar piece of furniture that has quietly been removed from a room you walk through every day. Something is missing. The room is the same. Something is missing. This is not a breakdown. This is a reckoning. The two look similar from the outside, and people who love you will sometimes confuse them, because the outward signs are the same. You are quieter, you are less available, you return calls more slowly, you leave dinners earlier, you stop offering the small attentivenesses that used to be your signature. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal, and the people who benefited from the old arrangement, even the ones who love you, even the ones who meant no harm, will reach for the language of concern, because concern is the only language they have for a change they did not authorize. Are you all right? You seem different lately. You used to be more present. You used to be easier to reach. They are not lying. From inside their experience, you have become harder to reach. What they cannot say, because they have never had to think about it, is that the part of you that was easy to reach was the part that had been on duty in their hallway, and the duty has ended, and the ending feels, to them, like a door has been closed that used to be open. They are correct. The door no longer answers when knocked, not in the old way, not on the old schedule, not by the listener who used to arrive before they finished knocking. The grief that comes with this is not the grief you expected. You expected, perhaps, to feel free. You expected the lifting of a weight, a small celebration in the chest, a sense of having stepped out of an old cage and into a wider air. Instead, what arrives is a quiet, complicated morning that you did not budget for. You grieve the listener. You grieve the small girl who learned the footsteps. You grieve the woman she became, who carried the listening into every room of her life, who was praised for it, who was loved in the only way the household knew how to love, who built an entire identity around an ear pressed to a hallway. She was real. She was not an act. She was you for 50 years. And now that you are turning slightly away from the hallway, you can feel, for the first time, how much of you was that listening, and how little you know of what remains when the listening stops. There is anger underneath the grief, and the anger is also not what you expected. It is not the cinematic anger you would be entitled to, the kind that names the people who used you and demands an accounting. It is quieter than that. It is the anger of someone who has just realized she has been doing unpaid work for 40 years, and the work was disguised as her personality, and the disguise was so good that even she did not see it. And now that she sees it, she cannot unsee it. And the people around her, even the kind ones, even the ones who would never have asked her to do it if they had understood, are going to need her to keep doing it, because the doing of it has become the way they know her. The anger is at the disguise. The anger is at the arrangement. The anger is, in a smaller and more painful way, at the small girl for having been so intelligent, so capable, so quick to learn the survival skill that has now cost her so much. And then the anger turns on itself, because she was 4, and what was she supposed to do? And the anger collapses back into grief, and the grief sits beside you at the breakfast table, and you drink the rest of your coffee slowly, and you do not know who you are becoming, and you cannot go back to who you were. The role paid you in a currency you could not refuse. This is the sentence that arrives now, late one evening, when the house is quiet and no one is asking anything of you. The currency was being the one who knew. The currency was the small, constant reassurance that you were necessary in a room where, otherwise, you might not have been allowed to remain. You did not stay in the hallway because you adored the hallway. You stayed because the hallway was where the wages were paid, and the wages, until now, were the only proof you had that you were welcome in the house. To stop listening is to stop earning. To stop earning is to discover whether the house will keep you anyway. And the discovery is terrifying, because for 50 years you have organized your life around the suspicion that the answer is no. The shadow does not appear as villainy. The shadow appears as this, the small, embarrassed recognition that the arrangement was not only done to you, it was also, in the quiet way of all survival economies, accepted by you, paid into by you, kept alive by you, long after the household that required it had dispersed into memory. The disowned material is not your darkness, it is your own quiet participation in your own long absence. And tenderness has to come back into the room here, because the recognition could turn cruel if it is left alone with itself. You did not choose the arrangement. You inherited it. You inherited it before you had any other tools, before you had any other vocabulary, before anyone had ever shown you that a child could be loved without first being useful. The participation was the only intelligence available to a 4-year-old in a house full of weather. The grown woman who now sees the participation is not the same as the child who entered into it. The seeing itself is the beginning of something the child never had access to. The seeing is the door beginning, very slowly, to unstick from its frame. The body becomes the first rebel. The mind will go on making excuses for a long time, because the mind has been the chief architect of the arrangement, and the mind has too much invested in the floor plan to dismantle it willingly. But the body has nothing invested. The body has been keeping the ledger, and the ledger has closed. And the body now refuses, in small ways, to perform the listening it used to perform. You sit down to a conversation in which the old you would have leaned forward, and you do not lean forward. You receive a message from someone whose weather you used to track, and your chest does not tighten the way it used to tighten, or it tightens, and then, somewhere underneath, a small refusal arrives, a small no that is older than language. The refusal does not announce itself, it simply withholds the lean, it simply does not stand up in the hallway, It simply lets the footstep pass, lets the door open, lets the weather enter, and does not adjust itself to meet the weather as it once would have. The mind, watching this, panics briefly because the mind knows that the lien was the wage, and without the wage, the household becomes uncertain. The body does not panic. The body has been waiting for this for 40 years. You cannot return to the old self. You can see her clearly now, the way you can see a photograph of yourself from a decade ago, and the seeing has the same quality, the same fond, slightly sad recognition, the same understanding that the person in the photograph believed certain things you no longer believe. But you do not yet know who is taking her place. The listener has set down her post, and the new one has not arrived. And you are living, for the first time in your life, in the hallway between the two, with the door behind you closed and the door ahead of you not yet visible, and the silence, which used to be the field in which you did your work, has become, instead, the room in which you are finally, slowly, learning to hear your own footsteps coming down a corridor you have never walked before. The corridor is unfamiliar in a way that nothing in your life has ever been unfamiliar. You have walked through new cities, new jobs, new houses, new decades, and in all of them, the listener was with you, doing her work, translating the new room into something the old nervous system could understand. Now the listener is sitting down. Now the translation is not arriving. You walk into a room and the room is simply a room. You meet a person and the person is simply a person. You do not lean forward into the weather of their interior, and the not leaning leaves you standing inside a kind of nakedness you do not have words for yet, because for 50 years the leaning was the clothing, and you did not know that underneath the clothing there was a body that had its own temperature, its own appetite, its own opinions about whether it wanted to be in the room at all. The people around you notice before you know how to explain it. The ones who loved the listener loved her in a particular way, and the love was real, and you are not going to be able to convince yourself otherwise, because cynicism would be easier than what is actually true, which is that the love was real, and the love was also tied to a service you no longer wish to perform. Both things sit together now in the same sentence, and neither cancels the other. The mother who depended on your reading, the partner who relied on your translating, the friend who called when no one else would understand, the colleague who could only function because your attentiveness held the edges of their day. They loved you. They also loved what you did. They could not always tell the difference because the difference had never been visible to them. And you, who could have shown them the difference, kept it hidden for so long that even you forgot it was there. They will say the things they say. You have changed. You used to be warmer. You used to be easier to reach. You used to understand me better than anyone. I do not know what has happened to you. Some of them will say it in concern. Some will say it in disappointment. A few will say it in a quiet anger that surprises you, because you had not understood until you stopped how much of their stability had been resting on your listening. They are not wrong about the change. They are only wrong about its meaning. The change is not that you have stopped caring. The change is that you have stopped paying the wage of your own absence in order to keep the room comfortable for everyone else. The difference is invisible from where they are standing, from where you are standing. It is the difference between a life and the long, well-made performance of one. You will grieve them, not all of them, but some, and the grief is not what the self-help language describes. It is not the clean grief of leaving people behind. It is the more complicated grief of remaining in the same room with them and no longer being the same person inside the room. You still love your mother. You still love your partner. You still love the friend who called at midnight for 20 years. The loving has not ended. What has ended is the arrangement in which loving them required you to disappear. They feel the disappearance of the arrangement and they call it the disappearance of you, because they have no other word for it. And you, who could once have explained it to them, no longer have the energy to translate yourself into a language that would make them comfortable with what you have become. So you sit with them, and the conversation is quieter than it used to be. And they look at you across the table, the way a person looks at a familiar house in which the furniture has been rearranged, and you do not rearrange it back, even though you can feel them wishing you would. Through a Jungian lens, this is the work that has no public ceremony. The shadow does not return in a single bright moment of recognition. It returns in small, daily refusals. It returns as the lean you no longer give. It returns as the follow-up question you no longer ask. It returns as the silence you allow to remain inside the conversation, even when every cell of the old listener is screaming for you to fill it. It returns as anger you do not apologize for, grief you do not minimize, desire you do not edit before speaking, exhaustion you do not pretend out of. None of these returns look heroic. They look small. They feel small. They feel, often, like failure, because the old self measured success by how well the listening was performed, and by that measurement, you are failing constantly now, and the failing is the doorway, and the doorway is the only way the new self has of entering. You will be tempted, sometimes, to return. The temptation will not arrive as nostalgia. It will arrive as efficiency. The old listening was so well developed that performing it again would be easier, in many moments, than tolerating the new awkwardness of not performing it. You will catch yourself in the middle of a difficult conversation, beginning to lean forward, beginning to read the weather, beginning to adjust your face into the listener's face. And the beginning will feel like coming home, because the body has muscle memory, the way a pianist has muscle memory, and the fingers will reach for the old keys before the mind has decided whether the song should be played. The work, now, is the small interruption, the pause inside the reaching, the breath that comes between the impulse and the performance, and the choice, made quietly, dozens of times a day, to let the impulse pass without acting on it. No one will see this work. No one will praise you for it. It is the most invisible labor of your life, and it is the first labor that has ever been done entirely for the small one who was listening behind the door. She has heard you. You did not announce yourself. You did not open the door with any ceremony. You simply, one ordinary evening, walked down the inner hallway and stood near the door, and the small listener inside it stood very still. the way she had learned to stand still and waited to see what kind of footstep you would turn out to be. You did not knock, you did not enter, you only stood there and let her hear you. And the standing was enough, because for the first time in 50 years, the footsteps in the hallway belonged to someone who was coming for her, not for the weather, not for the room, not for the management of the house, but for her. And the difference, which had never existed in her experience, registered in her body before it registered in yours. Something in the room behind the door softened. Something in your own chest softened with it. You did not need to go in. You did not need to fix her. You only needed to be the footstep that, for once, was not asking her to translate it. This is what individuation looks like when it actually arrives. Not a transformation, not a rebirth, not the becoming of a different person, the slow, quiet return of the one who was always inside, the small listener, the unheard interior, the body that kept its own ledger, the part of you that had been waiting at the breakfast table for 50 years for someone to sit down across from her and ask her, finally, what she had been hearing all this time. You do not have to ask yet. The asking will come in its own time, in its own small moments, in the cup of coffee that tastes different now, in the morning light that arrives without the listener's vigilance preceding it, in the conversation in which you allow a silence to remain and do not feel that the silence is your fault. The asking is the rest of your life. The standing in the hallway was only the beginning. You did not become someone new. You became someone who had stopped abandoning the one who was already there. The listener is still in you. The reading is still in you. The skill is real, and it will return when it is genuinely needed. And you will use it differently now, because you will use it from a self instead of from a survival, from a choice instead of from a debt. The hallway is still in you. The door is still in you. The footsteps you learned to read before you learned to speak are still in you, and they will be in you for the rest of your life, because they made you, and you cannot subtract from yourself the architecture that built you. What has changed is who walks the hallway now. What has changed is who the listening is for. What has changed is that the one inside the door, the one who has waited so long, has heard, for the first time, a step in the corridor that did not require her to disappear in order to receive it. You walked past the door without looking back, and the door, for the first time, did not need you to.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.